Hi, Tim.
Yeah, hey Gaudens.
Tim, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Hi, hello, Gaudens.
Yes, now I can hear you.
You've connected to our Teams?
Yes, and I'm sharing the screen, the Zoom screen.
Can somebody who is there, can they hear the audio? Unaweza log in alafu muonekana somebody can
Sawa, let me find somebody to log in.
log in alafu muonekana atasikia audio from also Teams.
Yeah.
Yes, sawa. So Gaudens,
Yes.
I've also made you co-host.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, you'll have the power to mute people.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we'll be vigilant about muting people, and maybe if there are questions, I don't know if there are any questions to panelists. I don't know how to manage to ensure that the panelists get them. If we miss anything,
then it will have to be from me.
For the questions for the panelists.
Yeah.
Don't admit guys yet. Don't admit guys yet.
Oh dear, I thought it was Teams.
No. Let me. I will just return them to the Nini. Don't worry. I'll just return them to the Nini, to the waiting room.
Hi team. Hi everyone.
Hey Jerome, how are you?
I am fine.
Habari ya ese.
Mzuri.
Unaishi, unajua sasa wewe ni mtu wa ese sahi.
Nilihamia huku. Nilihamia huku. Nipumue.
Ishi huko tu. Nunua shamba. Haya, sawa. Just wait for guys.
Hi, Tim.
Hi, you can hear me?
Yes, I can see Alison is trying to join from the Teams link.
Or from the Teams link. So you can just,
Yeah.
you can admit her and then maybe you share with her now the correct link.
Okay, so.
And then you just give her this link, tell her to join here.
Okay. You can admit Alison.
Yeah, hi, Alison.
Oh, I'm muted. Good morning from Canada.
We are good. 3 p.m. here, and yeah, thank you for waking up so early for this.
That's all right.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Timothy, yeah, and yeah, it's good to see you. So yeah, we're just waiting for the panelists, and then I think we should be good to start at the top of the hour.
All right. And will you be moving the slides or will we be sharing our own screens?
I can make you let me make you also co-host so that you're also able to share your screen and yeah,
Okay.
yeah, move at your pace. Yeah,
Perfect.
thanks.
Tim, the sharing is working okay. So whoever is in Teams can hear us.
Okay, that's okay. So do you know whether Valerie is joining?
I can ask her.
Okay, you can also.
Let me give her a call right now.
Okay, and okay.
So.
Gaudence. Gaudence, you can hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes, so I think now, so your co-host, you have the ability to admit people.
Yes.
Okay, so I think once we start, you'll just now be doing that, huh?
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, so I'm also making Val a co-host.
I've already admitted Nyokabi.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So the only panelist who is not here is Maureen and
Immaculate.
Immaculate. Yeah, let me check them.
Okay.
Hello, Gordons.
Yeah, hey Nyokabi, your sound is okay?
Hi, Nyokabi.
Yes, I believe you can all hear me. Now see me.
And we can see you, yes. Okay.
But I know I'm supposed to have a different background. Let me just sort that out now.
Okay.
Hi, team. You made me a co-host. You're already recording. Okay.
Is it? Yes, it is. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Hello, everyone. I hope you are well. So thank you for finding time to join the webinar today. We should be starting shortly. I can see more participants are joining. So in the interest of time, we will commence our conversation and discussion for the day as more participants join us. So yeah, first of all, I think I just want to take this opportunity on my own behalf, on behalf of Kelly, as well as the partners, the panelists and the partner organizations, HIV Justice Network, UGANET, Lean on Me, and IREP, and all of you for finding time to be able to have this conversation. So yes, so I think because we know we will be so many of us, maybe just a few ground rules. Yeah, you can maybe introduce yourself through the chat box. Maybe just say hi and just indicate from which organization or which part of the country or which part of the world you are joining us today. So as per the invitation, we want to have a conversation today around HIV criminalization, just have a conversation on why HIV is not a crime and why we actually need why we actually need to decriminalize. So your host for the day, my name is Timothy Wafula. I work with the Kenya Legal and Ethical Issues Network as a program manager, HIV/TB and key populations. So for those who have not interacted with Kelly is a human rights organization that advocates for a rights-based system of service delivery, and we advocate for the full enjoyment of the right to health for all. So some of our programs that we have include focus on HIV, TB, sexual reproductive health and rights, strategic litigation, women, land and property rights, as well as health and governance. So as a matter of introduction on why this webinar for today, first, we are aware that that overbroad and vague laws that criminalize HIV transmission have a lot of negative impact when it comes to public health responses. That these laws have continually created an environment where the rights of people living with HIV are violated. There's a lot of evidence out there, and I think through this webinar, we also seek to share more around this evidence that actually criminalization makes them, criminalization actually impedes the response to HIV. So this one clearly creates a barrier for HIV testing, treatment, and disclosure, and increases stigma and discrimination in the community. So recently, in December and recently, both in Kenya and Uganda, we've had two judgments. There were two cases that challenged laws that criminalize deliberate transmission or exposure of HIV. So through this webinar, we want to be able to hear what were the facts of these cases, what were the issues that came out of these cases, and as activists, as advocates, as communities, what are some of the things we can do moving forward to advocate against laws that criminalize HIV. So this webinar is convened by Kelly in collaboration with the Uganda Network of Law, Ethics and HIV, UGANET, HIV Justice Network, the Ambassador for Youth and Adolescent Reproductive Program, IREP, as well as Lean on Me Foundation, with the main objective of having a conversation, having a sensitization on why such laws criminalizing HIV undermine the response and measures that communities and the public at large can take to advocate against these laws. So for the next 1 hour, we do have 4 panelists joining us. And the panelists will share 1, the judgment from Kenya, 2, about the judgment from Uganda, 3, broadly on an elaboration on why the public should actually be concerned and advocate against laws that criminalize HIV, and and lastly, the impact of these laws when it comes to the HIV response. So allow me to introduce and welcome the first speaker or the first panelist for the day, Nyokabi Njogu, who is the legal counsel at the Kenya Legal and Ethical Issues Network, KELIN. Nyokabi is an advocate and will share with us, provide us with an overview of petition 447 that challenged Section 26 of the Sexual Offences Act, a section that criminalizes HIV. So over to you, Nyokabi, for the session. Okay.
Thank you, Tim. I see there seems to be some sort of problem with my video. Allow me to just switch it off quickly as I sort that out. Thank you for the broad introduction. My name is Nyokabi Njogu and I work as legal counsel at KELIN. We had been involved in litigation challenging the criminalization of transmission of HIV together with other partners. This case had been instituted in 2018 and was supported by 6 individuals, many of whom had actually not been involved in any sexual offenses. Now, the law, as it currently stands in Kenya, is that Section 26 of the Sexual Offences Act criminalizes the transmission of HIV in very broad terms. It says that, broadly speaking, that as long as somebody has transmitted HIV, then they are subject to a term of imprisonment of up to 14 years. But the way this section has been applied has led to various violations of people living with HIV. In this case, the individuals, like I've mentioned, none of whom were charged with a sexual offense. They involved a couple where one partner was living with HIV. And they then were afraid that they wouldn't be able to continue to live together as a couple or to establish a family because of it was hanging over them like a sword. There was also a woman who had been falsely accused of HIV and who was now being harassed into making some payments to some village elders where she was living based on HIV status. She was, her status was publicly disclosed by her neighbors. And on top of the violations around her violation to the right of privacy and the false accusation around her breastfeeding, she was also subjected to arrest and now taken to court and charged under this specific law. There was also a woman who had been subjected to intimate partner violence. She, like many women, had attended an antenatal clinic to go and start receiving care once she realized that she was pregnant. But when she went back home and disclosed her status to her partner turned violent and would not even allow her to take her medication in peace because he would continue to threaten her whenever he'd see her taking the medication that she would have her arrested for transmitting the virus to him. And there was also a man who had been a victim of police brutality. And when he fought back, he ended up biting a police officer. When he was charged in court, when he was being taken out to be charged for the original offense of resisting arrest, it turned out that he had actually been subjected to an HIV test without his knowledge or his consent. And because his test had come back positive, he was now being charged for transmission to the police officer. So these are the clients that had actually taken this matter to court. And they challenged this law and its application for being overbroad, for being extremely vague, and just generally for being used as a tool for harassment. In addition to the individual cases that are brought forth by the petitioners, the petition was also supported by 2 additional experts, one of whom was an advocate who has been involved in advocacy around the decriminalization of transmission and non-disclosure. And he brought evidence showing that criminalization or the use of criminal law against people living with HIV as a means to curb the transmission actually does not work. It undermines the HIV response. And the second expert who came to give evidence was a doctor who has a long history of working within the HIV space and HIV science, demonstrating the science around U is equals to U, that as long as somebody is adherent to medication and they're given the necessary and appropriate support to be able to take their medication, then the chances of them transmitting are basically nil. This doctor also demonstrated how the science has evolved and that there's even expert consensus from doctors who lead in this field of science to demonstrate that it is virtually impossible to transmit from one single instance, for example, through a bite in the case of the petitioner who had been subjected to arrest because of biting a police officer. In all, the petitioners also relied on the various statements brought forth by the Ministry of Health itself, demonstrating that laws that criminalize persons living with HIV actually undermine the public health response and only lead to violations of human rights. We also, as Kellen demonstrated, how this particular provision affects women, because women are usually the first to find out that they are living with the virus when they go for antenatal care. What then would happen is that they are subjected to more violations. They are the ones who have to go and disclose to their partners, which then in terms makes them even more vulnerable to HIV. And what then happens is that more women will then decide to not engage with healthcare facilities where they are being required to test because they are afraid of what a positive result would mean. We also showed how this law was being used to enable forceful testing for HIV and really just as a tool for extortion, and that it was not really serving the public health purpose. So we asked the court to make a finding around the manner in which Section 26 is extremely broad, to follow its own judgment in a previous decision where it had decriminalized transmission in the HIV Prevention and Control Act. But in this case, in a judgment that was delivered on 20th of December, the petition was dismissed. And while the court appreciated the experiences that the petitioner had and the individual petitioner had undergone, what the court then said was that there was no evidence that this was happening to them specifically because of their HIV status. The court did not really engage with the science that had been presented by the expert evidence or by amicus or the friends of the court. And the court said that this particular provision was a necessary tool to aid in the management of HIV, and the language that's used in the court by the court is actually to control HIV infection. However, there was one limited positive aspect in the sense that the court limited the application of Section 26, saying that for people who found themselves in the positions that the petitioners had found themselves, and that what then they could do was to try and approach the court, specifying what violations they had undergone. So that's really basically what this case was about. It's currently on appeal. We filed our appeal on 28th of December in the past year, and we are now waiting for directions from the Court of Appeal, as well as additional advocacy, trying to see how to ensure that that judgment is also not used as a means to continue the criminalization of transmission in a manner that violates the rights of persons living with HIV. Back to you, Tim.
Thank you, Nyokabi, for providing an overview of the case. I think you've seen the various, you've been able to hear the various, the facts of the various clients who petitioned against the case, and also the arguments that were put forth, and and the arguments that were put forth. So as we continue with the conversation, I think we will be able to allow our participants to be able to share questions. But as we are going on with the session, if you have any question, any comment, please feel free to type in the chat box, just indicating your question, so that and maybe who you are directing the question to, as and then the same will be answered as we proceed. So I just want to confirm that Immaculate has. Whether Immaculate has been able to join us. Just want to be able to confirm that. Immaculate, if you've been able to join us, you can just let me know. Okay, so yeah, as we get to, as we wait for Immaculate to be able to join us, and share about the facts of the case from Uganda, I would like to invite Alison from HIV Justice Network. Alison is an advocate, a researcher, and a project manager at HIV Justice Network that is based in Toronto, Canada. And Alison will just be able to share more with us. Why should we be concerned about laws that criminalize HIV? How has the science evolved, and what should we do moving? What are some of the recommendations that we can take forth moving forward? So, Alison, I will like to invite you to share as we progress. Yeah, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you from Toronto, Canada, other side of the world, early in the morning. I'm just going to share, sorry, my dog's getting excited. I'm just going to share some slides. All right, can I just confirm that the slides are visible?
Yes, they are.
Okay, perfect. Just to make sure. So as has been said, my name is Alison Symington, and I work with the HIV Justice Network. We're an international organization. Our staff's in a few different countries, and we really try and support and help people all over the world who are involved in the issue of HIV criminalization. So I think my role here this morning is you're going to hear about what's going on in Kenya and in Uganda, and I'm going to put it in an international context for you. So just to start, I want to look at a couple of maps. These were just updated by my colleague Edwin this month. So this is, hot off the press, up-to-date information. And this shows how HIV criminalization is an issue in much of the world. This is not limited to the countries we're discussing today. You'll see in this map the purple and the dark teal countries are countries where there have been prosecutions within the last decade, and that really covers a lot of the geography. The good news is change is happening. Here on this map, we can just see the bright green is HIV criminalization laws that have been repealed, and the darker green, the middle green, I guess it is laws that have been reformed. So change is happening, but really in just little pockets around the world. There's still very much work to do to solve this problem at an international level. And that's part of why we work to link people who are working on this issue around the world and to mobilize globally to try and get these laws changed and to end this harm. So, you know, if we know HIV criminalization is not good, but why have so many countries gone down this route? And there's really two sets of objectives that we can look at. So one reason used to justify HIV criminalization is to look at the role of criminal law in society. And this kind of sentiment comes out of the idea that transmitting HIV to someone else is bad behavior, and we want to stop that kind of behavior. We want to punish it. We want to deter it. So that's kind of looking at things from a criminal law perspective, that this is the kind of behavior that we as a society think is so terrible that we would use our most powerful tool, the criminal law. The second set of objectives is around health, and this is a bit different than other criminal laws because HIV is a health issue and it's a global health issue. So not only local health departments and individuals, but large international organizations and national plans exist to try and end the spread of HIV. So there are assumptions on the parts of some people, policymakers, that HIV will help meet these health objectives. It will, you know, increase testing and get people to go on treatment, and it will encourage consensual sexual activity and lower HIV prevalence. So those are kind of the underlying justifications for why HIV criminalization exists, the reasons people use to justify why it's necessary. We heard that in the case in Kenya, the court said this is necessary in order to stop the spread of HIV. So that's, you know, what's driving that side of the equation. But of course, in reality, that's not what's happening. You know, in reality, HIV criminalization is undermining public health objectives. It's not promoting testing and treatment adherence and those things. We see HIV criminalization is not a measured, appropriate response of using the criminal law, but instead is often an overreaction to something that's, you know, perceived to be a terrible risk and really isn't. When we look at the laws all over the world, we see that they're not up to date in terms of knowledge around HIV transmission, HIV prevention, and HIV treatment. Zooming out a little bit beyond just the HIV context, when we look at how these laws are applied and who is prosecuted, we see that HIV criminalization is often used as a proxy for increased state control and attacks on marginalized populations. And, you know, there's lots of different examples we can look at here, but just to take one quite current one, we see the criminalization of people living with HIV and the criminalization of LGBT populations, kind of getting all tangled up together. And that's what we're talking about here. And then finally, far from being kind of a measured and appropriate approach, we see HIV criminalization being driven by homophobia, by gender inequalities, xenophobia, racism, and it really perpetuates HIV-related stigma. So we get in a cycle of stigma fuels criminalization, and then criminalization creates more stigma. So what do these laws look like? You've heard a little bit about the provisions in Kenya. They're quite typical. Most of these criminal laws around HIV, non-disclosure, exposure, and transmission are overly broad, they're quite vague in the way they're worded, and they don't reflect up-to-date understanding of science. Additionally, they often single out HIV, which is inherently stigmatizing. They can criminalize behavior that isn't actually an HIV risk. As I said, they're quite vague, and so they don't define terms like willful transmission. What does that actually mean? And they often lead to disproportionately long sentencing. So compared to the harm that's actually committed, the sentences are quite outrageous, often up to life imprisonment. So what are the typical cases? All over the world, people are getting charged in different ways. But if we look at the cases, we'll see that most of them involve a person living with HIV having sex, and then an allegation that they did not disclose their HIV status to their sexual partner. That means that they often involve situations where there was no HIV transmission. In most cases, prosecutions proceed when there's a potential or perceived exposure, but no transmission. People face charges often when there is no or negligible risk of transmission. So we see prosecutions against people who have used condoms to prevent HIV transmission, who have low viral loads and are not able to transmit through sexual activity, in low-risk activities such as oral sex. And outside of sex, we also see cases, we tend to focus on the sexual cases because they're more prominent, but we also see many cases, and it was mentioned in Kenya, one of the complainants was charged in relation to biting, spitting, scratching, breastfeeding, different scenarios outside of sexual exposure as well. Some of the cases proceed with a faulty assumption of transmission. And what's meant here is often the first person in a couple who is diagnosed, which will often be the woman, is assumed to have infected the other person. No proof that that is in fact true. And it's rarely proven in these cases that an individual wanted to infect another person with HIV. While many of the laws say it should only be used if there's willful HIV transmission, not only is there often not transmission, the willful aspect, the fact that someone intended to transmit HIV, is seldom present. So this is a bit of a text-heavy slide, but part of what it shows is how many different ways HIV criminalization undermines public health. There is no evidence that criminalization prevents new HIV infections. And in fact, there's a lot of research, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of anecdotes that show different ways in which criminalizing HIV, non-disclosure, exposure, or transmission actually undermines public health messaging about taking responsibility and preventing HIV and protecting your partners. It contributes to misconceptions and false information in the public about how HIV is transmitted. It's been shown to create a false sense of security in people who are HIV negative or believe themselves to be HIV negative. So they believe falsely that because of the law, they will not be exposed to HIV. Another important piece is that criminalization really undermines trust between people living with HIV and health providers and service providers, so that people don't talk openly about their sexual practices or seek advice to minimize risk because they're afraid that information could later be used against them in a prosecution. Unlike the assumption that it will increase testing and treatment, we see that it actually deters testing, treatment, and care in certain situations. And as I've said, it reinforces stigma and discrimination against people living with HIV, which fuels all kinds of human rights abuses. So if we look at this as a human rights issue as well, as a public health issue, we see many different ways in which people's human rights and well-being are impacted by the presence of HIV criminalization laws. And these were some very good examples. The complainants in Kellen's case in Kenya showed some of these different impacts where the law can be used as a form of abuse or retaliation against sexual partners and ex-boyfriends and ex-girlfriends and ex-spouses. The law doesn't recognize the presence of intimate partner violence, and that some people may not be able to safely disclose or negotiate condom use. Investigations in these cases lead to all kinds of privacy rights violations and public disclosures of people's HIV status, even if the investigation doesn't go anywhere, even if charges aren't pursued. People's names and photos are already in the newspaper. If we look at the cases going on all over the world and we map them out, as we do at HIV Justice Network in our database, it's really obvious that there's a disproportionate impact in terms of who's being charged and how the prosecutions are impacting on people's lives. Sexual minorities, people who experience racism, migrants, women, all experience HIV criminalization as a very heavy burden. In some countries, we see some of the most serious offenses in the country's criminal code being used for consensual sexual encounters. It's just not a fit between what the actual activity we're talking about is and the heavy hand of the criminal law that's being applied. And we have those vastly disproportionate sentences that I mentioned earlier. So seeing all of those reasons that HIV criminalization is not helpful to end the pandemic, it's not helpful to protect the rights of people living with HIV or their sexual partners and families. With all of that before us, one of the key factors that comes out in any case, campaign, litigation strategy is always around HIV science. Many of these laws were enacted in Western countries, in high-income countries, quite a while ago, when we didn't know as much about HIV and we didn't have that scientific information yet. And the laws just haven't kept up with the science. There have been, further waves of criminalization at different points in the last 30 years. When those laws are enacted, they don't keep up with the science. So often, the risk of HIV transmission in any particular situation is assumed to be much higher than it actually is. The general public, police officers, the media, parliamentarians, they're not usually up to date on the science. And there's so much stigma and overreaction about HIV that it's assumed that there's a huge risk of transmission, often when there's no risk or very minimal risk at all. As well, we celebrate the effects of treatment and how far HIV treatment has developed in such a short period of time. And that HIV treatment doesn't just improve the health of people living with HIV, but also prevents onward transmission of the virus. These are things to be celebrated. But they're often not understood, again, by the uninformed public, police, parliamentarians, judiciaries. So the science piece becomes a very important piece in any HIV criminalization campaigning. For that reason, I wanted to bring your attention specifically to this one document. It's the expert consensus statement on the science of HIV in the context of criminal law. This is really a very interesting and important document. My apologies, my document. So this was published in the Journal of the International Society in July of 2018. Now, it was drafted by a global panel of HIV experts. So, my apologies. So it was drafted by a global panel in conjunction with the HIV Justice Network and HIV Justice Worldwide. And it's really a key reference because it takes the science and it explains it in the context of law. Law and medicine are different languages. This consensus statement brings them together and says, what does this science mean in the context of criminal law? So it's a really helpful document for any kind of law reform campaign, litigation, defense strategy. So just to conclude, a few thoughts on advocacy, because as is happening in Uganda and Kenya, also in many other parts of the world, we're working hard to try and end these laws that we know are so harmful. So in terms of advocacy, what we have found is that it usually works best to have a multi-pronged approach. There's no one strategy that's going to work everywhere. There's no one strategy that's going to work on its own. There are all kinds of stakeholders, as you see in the diagram there, that you need to think about that could have a role in changing a law, in changing perceptions in the public so that a law can be changed. So generally, advocacy strategies involve research and data gathering about your own country and your own local situation, as well as what's going on in the rest of the world, what international organizations say, what kind of evidence there is to back up your arguments. There's a lot of research and data gathering going on. As well, a lot of education and awareness raising is needed. There's so much misinformation about HIV, so much stigma, discrimination. You really have to be working against that and teaching people about the science. It's also important to be doing coalition building and movement building to get, lots of people on board and a strong base for campaigning. Legal defense work is important. So if there is a prosecution, someone is charged, they need to have a strong defense. And that becomes a key piece of advocacy as well. Strategic litigation. We've just heard about Kellen's case, and I presume we'll be hearing about the Uganda case. Those are very important pieces of work, as well as using international mechanisms such as UN human rights bodies. So lots of different pieces are generally going on simultaneously. So just to conclude, a few tips and lessons that we've drawn out from looking at advocacy that's gone on around the world. The first one is sometimes it's just not the right time in your domestic situation to pursue law reform, but there's always important work that can be done to build a foundation. You need to be building relationships. You need to be raising awareness. So there's always important work to be done. Communications are extremely important in this work. Messages need to be targeted strategically and respond to the context, respond to what's going on politically, respond to what's going on in the health sector. We've found that in many contexts, public health messaging is most important. So even if, as a human rights organization, what you're really concerned about is the rights of people living with HIV, it might be strategic to use public health messaging as your primary messaging. Storytelling is very powerful. Having people tell their personal stories about how HIV criminalization has impacted them, has impacted their organization, has impacted their community. That's a really good way to teach people and to change hearts and minds on this issue. Another piece of work that needs to be done is finding champions or influencers. So these could be parliamentarians who are willing to push a law reform agenda forward, or it could be celebrities or community leaders who can get messages into the media. There's all kinds of champions and influencers who can really help move an advocacy campaign along, and that's work that has to be ongoing to connect with those people. We also really recommend that you ensure there's a broad diversity in your coalition and work with other criminalized communities. The urge to criminalize HIV exposure and transmission is very similar to the urge to criminalize sex work, the urge to criminalize LGBT populations, the urge to criminalize poverty. So work together with other communities that intersect on that criminalization piece and have a broad diversity in your coalition to be strong and to see all of the different angles and to show that kind of a united front, really, really important in advocacy work. And finally, do no harm. And what we mean by this is that sometimes an advocacy strategy can have unintended consequences. So you really want to think about, if we change this law, or if we raise this particular argument in a piece of litigation, how will that affect other populations? So an example from the United States would be some law reform that was put forward with respect to people living with HIV, then had unintended consequences in terms of sex work. So, you know, you need to look at it from all angles and discuss it with your broad coalition and leave no one behind. You know, be strong and pull everyone together to fight against criminalization really is the best strategy in terms of this work. So I hope that's been helpful to provide a little bit of context. Just point out that HIV Justice Network has a bunch of different resources that can be helpful in this work. We've got a global criminalization database where you can find out about cases and laws all over the world. And we've just in the last 6 months launched an online course with action toolkits and a library where you can find the type of evidence I've been talking about in terms of human rights and public health law, and learn a lot more about this issue. So please make use of our resources as they can help you in your work, and my contact information is there if I can be of further help to anyone. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Alison, for that elaborate presentation, just sharing the argument. I think that really gives us a very good foundation and good advice around the advocacy strategies, what we need to do. And yes, so thanks for that. So I know participants have questions. Colleagues, feel free to type your questions in the chat box. And I think at the end of the webinar, we'll have a quick Q&A to be able to provide responses to that. So allow me to just connecting again to the conversation, the presentation from Alison. I think now we'll be able just to hear about the case in Uganda, what were the issues that came out of the judgment, and what were the arguments, and I think just linking the same to the broad argument against HIV criminalization. So over to you, Immaculate, for to share about the case in Uganda.
Yes, thank you so much, Timothy. Just to confirm that I'm being heard. Yes, yes, and sincere apologies for the technical challenges. I first went to the Teams and my audio could not connect in one way or the other. So, and I saw the Zoom link later. So apologies on that, but I've been really on hold. I just had those technical issues. So allow me to switch off my video. I don't have good visibility where I am. I'm not in Uganda currently. I'm in Johannesburg, and the time zone kind of also affected me, but I am here and ready to present. Yes, so thank you so much. So yes, about Uganda and the law, HIV and the law. So in again, for introduction purposes, I'm Immaculate Omjisha. I head advocacy and strategic litigation at UGANET, which is Uganda Network on Law, Ethics and HIV, a sister organization for KELIN in Uganda. And UGANET in 2016, we took a petition to court. For the history background is around 2014, the country passed a law, which is the HIV Prevention and Control Act, which heading is different from the East African HIV law, which is the HIV Prevention and Management Act. For Uganda, it is HIV Prevention and Control Act. So when this law is passed and assented by the president in 2014, the law came with 80% of the law is good. It has progressive sections on HIV prevention and care. It has progressive sections on HIV fund. But with all the progressive sections, there were those sections that really are problematic in terms of HIV response. And the sections clearly were focusing on, most of the sections are on the ones we challenged on HIV criminalization. Then we had also a section on HIV transmission, intentional transmission, and then attempted transmission. So in 2016, we challenged this law. We had followed up, done a lot of advocacy before the law was passed. And our advocacy, we had all hopes that the law is going to be passed when it is really a progressive law. But as we know how our MPs always work, it wasn't the case that we were really focusing on and forecasting. So the law is passed, and one of the section that was problematic is section 18E of the Prevention and Control Act. And this section 18E is giving a section which is really not progressive in nature. Section 18E permits the medical worker to disclose someone's HIV positive results without consent from the person who has been found to be HIV positive. So you know what that means. And this disclosure, the law goes ahead and says the medical worker can disclose your HIV status to any person in close and continuous contact. But the law does not define what amounts to close and continuous contact, and does not define the parameters of disclosure. So we challenge the section in our petition in that same area, that the law this section is overboard and vague in nature, and we needed court to support and help us in interpretation. Then the other section that we challenged in our HIV petition was section 43(1) of the Prevention and Control Act, which criminalizes intentional spread of HIV. And again, we in our petition, we sought court to interpret for us what amounts to intentional transmission, because the law does not interpret intentional transmission. Still, we challenge the third section that we challenged is section 41 of the Act, which for it was looking at, was criminalizing, we have intention, we have disclosure, then we have attempted transmission. So for it is criminalizing attempted transmission. And then under section 14, we go ahead and 44, we go ahead and see criminalization now really happening, and that's where the sentencing and all that is embedded in. So our arguments under this petition, which we filed in 2016, and we could only get judgment in 2022 last year around November. That's when we got a judgment which was not in our favor, and we lost our petition. But in terms of argument and who are the petitioners that brought this petition, petitioners were Uganet, the organization that I'm presenting on this call, and we had a international community of women living with HIV, bringing in a perspective of how the law is affecting women. And then we had two medical experts, a medical doctor openly living with HIV, who has done a lot of care for people living with HIV in Uganda, bringing in what does it mean for public health and why we should not criminalize HIV. And like Alison said, we had another affidavit brought in by an expert, and one of the author of the document that Alison talked about, which is the expert consensus statement on HIV science. So one of the authors, who is Dr. Paula, gave us a strong affidavit to show court why why HIV science has progressed and why people cannot now be criminalized for transmitting HIV without looking into what science is telling us. So in terms of evidence, in terms of having enough affidavits to support our petition, we believed that we were very strong. We had given court enough evidence and guidance on what the law should be like and where we need interpretation. We also had actually another expert affidavit from a UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights. Then that was an ad. And again, it's bringing in the issue of human rights, public health. And then we had also Professor Ben, who is a lecturer in Makerere University, who is the founder, the person who introduced health and the law in the university, again, bringing in another broader area of academic and then public health as a concern and how the law is going to drive steps back in terms of addressing HIV as a public health concern. So for us as petitioners, we are really comfortable that we had done enough in terms of getting enough evidence to guide court on what this law should be looking like. So our argument broadly were on the issue, were brought under the interpretation article of our constitution, seeking court to interpret for us some of the issues that are not really clear when it comes to if people are going to use the law, you can't understand what is intentional transmission, what is close and continuous contact. The fields were not also defined because under close and continuous contact, there is an angle that as long as you're in close and continuous contact of body fields. So that was also not well defined. And we made also argument on how the law is going to increase stigma and discrimination, issues of domestic violence. And there we went into under the Bill of Rights, looking at our constitution is very progressive on non-discrimination of all people. So we brought in that. But with all the evidence, with all the arguments that we put across, very unfortunate for us as litigators, but also from the advocacy and civil society perspective, we were shocked to see the judgment from the judges. So this is a bench of 5 judges, and they all anonymously agreed on one contentious issue. They did not look into the other arguments. They only looked at the issue of interpretation. And the anonymous agreement, if I can read verbatively, for example, under section 18E, the honorable judges indicated that whereas the act does not define the phrases close and continuous contact, nature of contact, exposure to bodily fields and bodily fields, the phrase that they went ahead and said the phrases do not defy the interpretation of courts, because proof of these circumstances depends on the evidence. So for us as litigants, it showed us that clearly they did not even go into HIV science, and the whole statement that was attached, the expert consensus statement that was attached to our petition, they only went into what evidence can be produced should someone be charged under this law. So for them, they looked at the distinguishable and also how you can refer to the other laws that probably have already interpreted some of these words. So and all the judges anonymously agreed. So, which came as a surprise to us, but we've not stopped there. We've already lodged our notice of appeal in the Supreme Court, which is our last court of judicature as a country in Uganda. But where we are worried now is that the same judges that handled our petition and the lead judge, to be specific, was promoted to the Supreme Court. So even if we are to go to Supreme Court now, we are going to be appealing against the judgment of someone now who is going to again be hearing it at the Supreme Court. So there is that whole issue that we are now struggling with. Even when we go to Supreme Court, we are going to meet the same faces, and that kinds of worries us as litigants on what are we expecting when we go to Supreme Court. Yeah, so broadly about the case, that's the case. But what I also wanted to add is, and to pick from what Alison said on the advocacy, really we did advocacy. We engaged the judicial officers. We had a lot of trainings as the case was in court. But I don't know, human nature, I think, is human nature. And I don't know, Alison probably could guide beyond these behind doors engagements that we do with our policy makers. What else can we do that can form these policy reviews and policy reforms? Because oftentimes we engage the same people and you feel they've progressed right from parliament to the gauge, and you have very good promises. People look like they've understood. Then when they reach the other side, things don't turn out to be as you expected. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that. It may be Alison, it may be all of us, but I think we need to reflect deeply on how we do our advocacies around these cases. In terms of how this law affects community, for us, for me and for us as a country, we have been doing a lot of sensitization about the law, right from when it was a bill to now engaging the prosecutors, the police officers, the judicial officers. And for a very long time, we had never registered any case that has been charged under this law from the time it was passed until this year in, I think, January, when we saw one of the cases being reported in media where a woman is being charged under Section 18E and under Section 41 on attempted transmission and intentional transmission. So we are starting to see the law bite the community. And also what is worrying that now for us as Uganda, every law that is being passed has a component on HIV criminalization. You see that the bill on homosexuality law, which was just recently passed by Parliament, as we wait the president to assent, HIV is an aggravating factor, which is again criminalizing HIV. You go to the Penal Code Act, there is HIV criminalization. So any law that is being passed right now has an HIV component. So as we speak to that, the cases, the constitutional cases that we've lost as Uganda and Kenya, and as we pick learnings, how do we broaden this conversation and see that other laws that are being passed, again, do not reintroduce HIV criminalization? Again, a question for all of us all on the call. Yes, thank you, and over to you, Timothy, and apologies for over speaking. Thank you.
Thank you, Immaculate. Yeah, no need to apologize. Yeah, so because that's really important. You've raised really some serious questions, issues to reflect, and I think just connecting to your conversation and your Kabi and Alison around that. Yes, these are legal strategies that we've been having. How do we connect all these to existing advocacy? How do we ensure we continue the documentation, sensitization, and just ensuring that there's continued vigilance. And I think it's becoming out clear that yes, advocacy really does take time, but there's a need, and the negative consequences are actually being demonstrated by your argument. So thank you for that. So as we almost come to the close of the conversation, I'd like to invite Jerop, the Executive Director, Ambassador for Youth and Adolescent Reproductive Health Program, IREP, who will be able to share with us quickly just perspectives around how HIV criminalization perpetuates stigma and discrimination, especially among young people. So Jerop, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Alison has said it's quite early where she is. So good morning, everyone, from wherever you're joining us from. My name is Jero Plimo. I am the Executive Director for Ambassador for Youth and Adolescent Reproductive Health Program. And basically my daily life is HIV. Such a very interesting conversation because I'm just thinking about what is happening in our countries, thinking about conversations and messages being shared online by leaders, influential people, religious persons, our own communities that continue to perpetuate a lot of stigma and discrimination, just to mention but a few instances. Just thinking about HIV criminalization by itself, I think this makes HIV look like a moral issue and not necessarily a health issue. HIV is a health issue. You know, it makes us, people living with HIV, feel like we are criminals and that there's always a law or people watching over behind our backs to see if we will infect the next person. Apparently, if we will increase the number of infections in our country, that continues to instill fear in many young people living with HIV in the diversity, of course. I think a key aspect is that the existence of this law alone is the recognition of people who are living with HIV as immorals and criminals. That is one. Number two, a key aspect is that we people living with HIV we are the ones who have the mandate of ensuring that we do not transmit, which is something that we are way past. You know, Alison talked about the involvement of science and technology and how far we've come, where we're talking about aspects of U is equals to U, where we're talking about major and better prevention commodities. So shifting the burden from saying that me as a person living with HIV, I am a criminal because I am the one knowingly infecting other persons. And then there's the aspect of the fear it continues to instill in many of us, that you need to be consciously careful so that you do not infect other people, that you need to ensure you are aware about aspects of disclosure, aspects of who you decide you want to have sex with. And of course, we're talking about reproductive health, so limitations and people making choices for us, because there is a law that will take me to jail if I am found to have knowingly infected someone. A key aspect is how it continues to take us back in the HIV response. Of course, being cognizant that we've made a lot of efforts, a lot of changes have happened. But imagine every single day as a person living with HIV, I am reminded that I need to be very careful, that I need to be careful to who I disclose my status to, even if I am in dire need of support. You know, probably it's a healthcare provider, probably it's a friend, probably it's family members, and we all know we need support, you know. And these all issues being umbrellaed by the HIV criminalization law continue to contribute to delayed diagnosis. For example, a lot of poor health outcomes that happen in between, a lot of increase in terms of transmission, because then people are so reluctant to go and access services, then people are so afraid to communicate and seek help even when they're struggling with adherence, because there is a law that is criminalizing us. And of course, it just talks about the aspect of power, and just thinking about the cases that have been shared by Nyokabi, and the aspect that someone who has power would use this law to actually arrest someone, even if the transmission didn't happen. You know, we're talking about the man who beat the police officer because he was being beaten. For sure, anyone will defend themselves against being beaten. Nobody will just stand and receive a beating without protecting themselves. And then there's the aspect of access to services. Just thinking about how young people, right now, the prevalence of HIV is high amongst young people. We are disproportionately affected by HIV. And this law continues to limit, it instills fear in so many young people who we are constantly telling, go get tested, use a condom, come access your services. But back in the heads of these young people is that I might be able to be found positive. Will I be asked about the people I have slept with? Will I be told that I need to ensure I don't knowingly infect people, that I need to carry the burden and the responsibility of HIV transmission as a young person? And of course, that has led to a lot of late seeking of treatment and support by so many young people. And just thinking about the aspect of criminalizing laws, sex workers who are young people, queer persons who are young people who are living with disability and able differently, survivors of gender-based violence, all these young people in the diversity continue to feel hindered, continue to feel like criminals, continue to carry and bear the burden of HIV transmission, yet it shouldn't be one-sided. A key aspect is, how do we ensure that the law is reformed? I think we've talked about advocacy, we've talked about constantly being reminded that these are people, that before we are numbers, we're actually people. So the reform of this law would go a long way in ensuring that, one, young people are able to freely access services, but number two, that this is not a one-sided burden, that this is not a role and a responsibility every person living with HIV has to carry, but it becomes a mandate of every person, whether living with or affected by, whether positive or negative, irrespective of our diversities, that all of us are cognizant that the transmission of HIV is a stakeholder role. It's a multi-sectoral responsibility, not necessarily by the one person who is positive. A key aspect is to also empower people. Just thinking about how many times this law has been misused by people makes me want to be careful with myself and with my status and with my life, because people who don't necessarily understand the implications of this law will most of the time use it against vulnerable people. And then we've heard about the cases that have been shared, where people in power, where people who have some sort of capability above others will most of the time use this law against people who are not able to speak up for themselves, will most at times use this law to criminalize and lock people, who will most at times use this law to justify their injustices to us. So the aspect of shifting power, ensuring that communities are empowered and aware that they have actually rights, and that science has evolved. Transmission doesn't work that way anymore. And I think people really need to be very cognizant of that we've made so many interesting strides, and that HIV is not just passed by touching and hugging and breastfeeding. We have made strides. Our own HIV guidelines allows women who have children to breastfeed. It does, of course, with key health guidelines and instruction, but we are allowed to have children. We are allowed to enjoy our sexual lives, of course, reproductive health. We are allowed to exist and not carry this baggage alone. So the aspect of empowering our community so that they are able to be empowered to be able to defend themselves. I constantly say that, why not for Kelin, what would have happened to those women? Why not for Uganet in Uganda for intervening and making the efforts that they're making? Who will defend the rights of queer persons in Uganda? So the shift of power that is constantly carried by our policymakers, our law enforcers, our governments, which is a really bad thing. And then there's aspect of shift of responsibility, like I constantly say, is that it's not about me alone, it's about the two of us as consenting adults carrying this package alone. Even when I'm not able, when a young girl or a young woman is not in a position to negotiate for safe sex, let it be known that it was two people and it was not just one person who is most often carrying this blame and carrying this burden. Let it be known that it was a responsibility of two people and not one person, and let it not be perpetuated in the aspect of being positive. A key aspect is the existence of this law continues to put notions into people's head that you know, HIV is a moral issue. This is bad behavior. That's why you're positive and you're here intentionally infecting people. And I quote, that has been the notion, that has been the conversation in our spaces, that has been the idea that our communities continue to spread and believe in. So the review and the reform of this law will ensure that people are respected. That is number one, that people are respected, that people understand that they have a responsibility on their own health, and that nobody will make those choices for you. You have to be in charge of your health and make those choices for you. And of course, being cognizant that HIV is a health issue. It is not a moral issue. It is not a habit issue. It is not a lifestyle issue. It is a health issue, and it must be seen that way. And ensuring that the rights of people living with HIV are protected irregardless. A key aspect is just looking at the current status of our communities. We've talked about Uganda, we've talked about Kenya, and how things are moving. Seems like we need to make sure we hold our shields firm, just to ensure that choices and more laws that are criminalizing are not enforced. We've talked about access to safe abortion, for instance, the existence of queer persons by itself, HIV itself. All this law continue to speak against human rights. They continue to violate our rights. They continue to perpetuate a lot of stigma online, physically, in our communities, in our home, and in our societies. And the worst thing is that there is so much we can do, but I think that we need to hold each other accountable. We need to call each other out. It makes me angry when I go through online and I see my own health CS speaking about issues of people in such a manner, yet he is a decision maker, yet he is an influential person. What does that mean? It means that there is no accountability in these spaces, that they don't get to hold themselves to their mandate. And that is our responsibility as CSOs, as community, to ensure that they protect our rights, that they are reminded that our rights are not just words in the constitutions or in the documents or in the treaties they sign on to, but it is a commitment for them to be able to protect our rights, come what may, regardless of our diversities. So a key aspect is shift of power, responsibility, perception and notion, and viewing HIV as a health issue and not a moral issue, but consequently ensuring that this law is reformed, because it's not looking good. It's not looking good. Plus, it's making the response difficult. It's making the response difficult, that women are scared to breastfeed their children, that young people are afraid of going to access services, that we are afraid of disclosing our status to our partners because we do not know what would happen next to us, that we are afraid of seeking health services because we might end up in prison because of not taking our medication, for instance. And of course, let us just be frankly honest, because HIV also has structural issues. And the only way we will address some of these issues is if we address such a policy that continues to make the challenge even difficult. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jerome, for highlighting that. I think that is really important questions, important issues. You've raised things that we need to think about, things that actually, as you are actually putting it out there, are issues that should make sense to everybody. However, you find pushback and challenges when it comes to this. So thank you for sharing that. So cognizant of time, I will quickly allow our last panelist, Maureen, to be able to also come in and also speak a little bit more around how, again, these laws really perpetuate stigma, lead to gender-based violence, especially among women. So, Maureen, the floor is yours. But colleagues, as we come also to almost the end of the webinar, questions that you have, kindly type them in the chat box. So, Maureen, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the speakers who have spoken ahead of me. So they have made my intervention even shorter. So I'll get off video because I'm on the way. So first of all, I want to say that every time we talk about, we try to bring people on board on this law, especially if they're not living with HIV, they tell us that we are promoting intentional infection by people living with HIV. And I don't think this is it, but we are also very cognizant of the fact that there are bad people in the society who would maliciously or purposely transmit HIV with an intent to harm others. But this is not the majority, and this doesn't justify having a blanket law that criminalizes everyone living with HIV. So I think because everyone has said the reasons, we have given examples, I'll talk to us about the need to keep fighting. We have had cases that haven't been very successful, but that doesn't stop us from keeping up the fight. And the reason we should fight is because applying this law does not reduce the spread of HIV. We don't have evidence anywhere in the world that the criminalizing laws helps to reduce new infections. Instead, they promote a new infection, or they undermine HIV prevention efforts, because people are now afraid of getting to know their status. People do not seek prevention services, and those that are on treatment, despite the fact that there's evidence that treatment reduces or completely eradicates HIV infection, people still fear go to hospitals for treatment. And then these laws also promote fear and stigma. We have seen cases where people have been going long distances to take treatment because of that fear. And the fear of being branded HIV positive. You know, like, it's obvious that if you're HIV positive, you are a candidate to this law, and therefore you could go to jail, depending on how people translate it, and depending on if someone decides just to blackmail you, and despite the fact that you're in a beautiful relationship, they could claim that you did not disclose your status or you had the intent of infecting them. So it really, that really promotes a lot of fear. And we have seen where people have been blackmailed to the extent of getting depressed and losing their lives. When we talk about women, women are traditionally very oppressed by the gender inequalities in our society, the violence perpetrated on them. But you find that these laws help to promote programs that increase the vulnerability of women to violence. For example, it is the women who, when they have or they're pregnant, they go to for antenatal clinic, where they are forced to test for HIV. They are forced to disclose their status to their partner. And when they do this, they are blamed for bringing the infection home. And so either they are blackmailed, or they are bullied for the rest of their marriage, or they are beaten, or they are threatened, or they are incarcerated from their home. So this law is just builds on to the other factors that oppress women in societies. And then we have also heard from people are being punished for behaviors that are not blameworthy. For example, spitting. How does spitting transmit HIV? Scientifically, it's not possible. So I think it also fuels punishment for behavior that is not blameworthy. And then we have told sometimes it's applied unfairly and selectively. There's a time Kelly had a case of a woman who was taken to court with her husband for having HIV. And this woman, Kelly were trying to get justice for this woman because the ruling had been done. So they were trying to, they appealed for the woman to get justice, because once the judge heard that this woman had HIV, she did not ask for the husband to be tested. Instead, she separated the woman from her family, and from her family and children for fear that she could infect them. Kelly appealed the case to success, but these are some of the laws that are applied unfairly and hence really bring a lot of mental health issues. This was a strong woman who survived that. Many others. And then the laws ignore the real challenges of HIV prevention. The real challenges of HIV prevention are around access, are around addressing stigma, are around addressing human rights violation, and availing services that respond to the need of the people. HIV prevention cannot thrive in criminalizing people. So rather than introduce criminalizing laws, we need to keep engaging the legislator to reform laws that are criminalizing and hindering access and promote those that are human rights sensitive and that are considered the gender disparities and promote access to services. Thank you.
Thanks, Maureen, for that. You've actually done my work for me, so I can even close the webinar. You've actually summarized and then the issues that have come up, put them into context around why we need to keep on fighting, what the real challenges need to be, some of the unintended, the real issues that happen with the existence of this law in the society, the blackmail, the the violence, and all that. So thank you for that. And yes, so I know at this time we have around 10 minutes for quick Q&A. So I'd ask colleagues to share in the chat box if you have any question. So if you have any question, you can also raise your hand. Maybe I can give 3 or so people an opportunity, but some of the issues coming from the chat box include maybe now the fear around if we have such laws, how do we even continue with programs like partner notification services, because then that one can expose the person to prosecution. There were questions or comments around the need to review the process and management of school-age children, particularly borders. I think that sometimes even by the time the parents disclose to staff of the school, everyone, immediately the parents are disclosed to the teachers. For instance, this one now the information spreads to the school, and there is a stigma and discrimination affecting adherence. Also saw a question or a comment around if you find someone is disclosing your status without your consent, what do you need to do? What can you do around that? And a few more questions that came about. What do we need to do to end HIV criminalization in Kenya, and how do we ensure that we are able to end stigma and discrimination arising as a result of HIV discrimination? So those are some of the comments. So those are some of the questions that have been posted in the chat box. But I want to allow maybe one or two of us, of the participants, if you have any question, if you can raise your hand, and I'll provide you with that opportunity to ask it directly. Okay, so given that I cannot see any hands as at now, I think maybe the message is coming out very clear. So I'll quickly give the panelists 1 minute each to maybe, if you have any additional closing remark that you want to make, or any response to the comments that I've just read, feel free to respond to that. So I'll quickly start with, I can see some comment here that we need to continue enlightening the community, especially when they are violated because of the disclosure of status. Most of them fear going to court and yeah, fear that if they disclose, they will be taken to court for things like that. So more comments are coming in. But now over to colleague, to panelists, to in 1 minute share your closing remarks or any response to any of the questions that have been shared in the chat box. So I'll start with Nyokabi.
So thank you, team. Just to confirm that I can now be seen, and I hope my screen is no longer green.
Yes, we can now see you very clearly.
Thank you. I apologize for before. So very interesting conversations, and I think even from the community and from the people who work with communities such as Jerop and Maureen, I think their passionate pleas are really around how can we stop or prevent or minimize stigma so that persons living with HIV can continue to live lives with dignity, just like they are entitled to under the promise of our Constitution. I think there's the need for continued vigilance. I beg your pardon. The need for continued vigilance to ensure that persons living with HIV are not being unfairly subjected to criminal law. So that's the first thing. And then there are of course, the legal responses to that. One of the things that we've taken from the judgment, in as much as it was negative, is that sorry, something came up on the screen. So one of the things we've taken from the judgment is, one, there is need to do continuous training. The judge herself in her judgment actually said that there's a need for duty bearers to be able to appreciate the nature and science of HIV. And it was ironical that the court made that finding even in the context of dismissal of the petition. But I think it does point to something important, which is that prosecutors, courts, even lower courts of the magistracy, are not quite appreciating the nature of the advancements made in science. So this is something that as Kelly, of course, we're going to take forward. And it's going to be, it has to be on a continuous level, just the engagement of the duty bearers to ensure that we all understand, we are all on the same page. Secondly, is just around advocacy also with the community and just the general public at large. There's need for also us as individuals to be able to speak out about these issues, to continue to have more advocacy at community or local level so that people can be able to understand how laws like this harm the response. I've seen somebody ask around mothers who do not adhere to medication and then they end up, the transmission ends up. But I am aware that there are guidelines that are supposed to facilitate it. Now this is now for us to hold the state accountable. How do we ensure that every person who needs to be on medication is actually on medication? And I know the National AIDS Control Council, now the Syndemic Disease Control Council, has stated that there are some gaps in terms of people who should be on medication and who are not. And then it's just to ensure that our health system is more robust so that we are able to capture everybody who needs treatment, and not just treatment, but the things that facilitate treatment. If it's counseling, to figure out exactly why the issue around non-adherence to medication, because the science has shown us that as long as you're adherent, but it's not just about taking the medication, it's also the other social determinants around the health system that enable you be able to live as you continue to live a healthy lifestyle for yourself. So that's work that we need to continue, not just as individual organizations, but of course as a community. And thirdly is strategic litigation. Because while this petition was dismissed at the High Court, there are still other courts to go. And we continue to know that the law and the courts continue to hold promise for the respect, protection, and fulfillment of rights. So it's just an assurance that Kelly intends to continue with this advocacy, the legal advocacy in court up to the end, because we do truly believe that while it may take long, eventually justice shall be found for the individual petitioners, but also for the continued, just for access to justice, broadly speaking. Thank you, Timothy.
Thank you, Nyokabi, and I can see more comments are coming in. Mothers who are not adhering should be taken through treatment literacy, adherence counseling, and other psychosocial support services that will promote adherence. Thank you, Maureen, for sharing that. And I can see some more comments and questions around these. So, Immaculate, 1 minute, so that as we also conclude these some closing reflections or maybe responses to any of the questions in the chat box. Immaculate, over to you.
Okay, yeah. Yes, thank you so much, Timothy. I'll just respond probably. I've seen in the chat room, and I think most of the questions have been answered, but I can give my closing highlight. And for me, it is on advocacy. How are we going to strategize our advocacy efforts without losing the niche of strategic litigation? Definitely, we are all going to Court of Appeal or Supreme Court, and when we exhaust our local remedies, we definitely seek redress in the other regional and international probably jurisdiction for addressing this issue. But I think beyond court, we could also look into what other law review platforms do we have in our country and who are our allies. In Uganda, with the support of Global Fund and addressing human rights barriers, we've seen progressive steps coming from DPP, Director of Public Prosecution, and they're the ones saying that, look, this law, we find it difficult to charge people under the law. Can we be the ones now writing to Parliament and asking Parliament to cause amendment in some of these sections? Then we have the Uganda Law Reform Commission saying, oh, by the way, first of all, the law has been in place for this long, so it's due for review, and we can start a discussion. So I think there are those in-country commissions and departments which we can use to have our diverse advocacy strategies happening at different levels. For me, that is one area I've been reflecting on, and I think we are reflecting on as a country, as we are in court, how do we use other strategies? But then the second issue, and as I think it was Maureen who discussed that, we don't need to forget that behind these laws, they are human beings. And we've seen this with even the passing of the anti-homosexuality law in Parliament. The moment Parliament made its own pronunciation on the law, we saw communities, I think, get double violations, as the situation is worse just by Parliament pronouncing itself. And it is the same with the HIV law, that as we get probably judgments which are not progressing, as the country continue to legislate on some of these issues, for us as advocates, how are we supporting the human beings behind the laws? How are we preparing the communities to respond, but also take precautions in terms of ensuring that they are not in conflict with the law, because the laws as is right now are not enabling. So for me, those are like two areas of we need to reflect on as advocates and strongly reflect on them to see on how do we reintegrate, re-strategize and re-engage some of the strategies we are using in our work. Yeah, thank you, Timothy.
Yeah. Thank you, Immaculate, for those closing remarks and just connecting and yes, reminding everybody that yes, the need to know we are actually dealing with people. Yeah, and that's something that we really forget even as we criminalize other vulnerable populations. So thank you for that. Alison, I will now ask you maybe in 1 minute just to say maybe closing reflection or answer to any question.
Thank you. And I'll keep my reflection very short. I just want to recognize the great work being done by all of you and by all of the co-panelists. I think what's come out very strongly in this discussion is that there's so much work left to be done, and there's so many challenges that we're facing. But beyond that, so much commitment and energy and passion around these issues. So I hope we can continue to work in solidarity. and support one another in all of these different challenges, because as was said, eventually, hopefully sooner rather than later, but justice will prevail. So thank you all for having me today and for the marvelous work that you are doing.
Thank you, Alison, for those words. And yes, need for solidarity. We need to continue working together. A lot has happened, and a lot will continue working. So thank you for those kind words. Jerome, I'll also give you 1 minute to say last word.
Thank you, Tim, and a big kudos to everyone and all the panelists for their really rich engagements. I think for me is the aspect of accountability, just being cognizant about conversations we've had about human rights, being cognizant about the commitments our governments have made, the treaties they have signed on to, and their actual responsibility to seeing this through and ensuring we hold them accountable to those positions. I think the fact that many communities and many people are not empowered, then we are not able to fight when we need to fight. We're not able to come out and speak out and hold people accountable. So ensuring that even as we do our advocacy, we are able to hold our duty bearers accountable to their commitment to us as citizens. Number 2 is empowerment, community empowerment. I would never stop insisting this enough, because there's so much we can do. And of course, this journey has been long and it will continue to be long, but I believe that complete understanding and knowledge will enable people to be in positions to seek help and reach out to Kelin, for example, and reach out to Uganet, and to be able to defend themselves if they face any form of injustice, including HIV criminalization. But if they're not empowered, then many people continue to experience forms of violence. Many people continue to fear accessing services. Many young people living with HIV will continue to feel and carry a baggage and a burden that they're not supposed to carry. But if they're empowered, then this becomes a shared responsibility. Then they are able to speak out and call out people who violate them, that they're able to seek justice. Just thinking about the availability of the HIV tribunal, for example, that people are aware that they can actually go out and seek help and not just feel vulnerable and sit with the violations and entertain them just because they feel they are less or they don't have a right. I think a key aspect is making sure that people understand that they are rights and these rights are theirs. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerome, for those great closing remarks. Importantly, accountability, empowerment, access to justice, very important. Maureen, I'll give you 1 minute.
Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you to everyone who has been involved in the fight for this kind of justice. Thank you for all activists, those who are not identifying as activists, who have been involved in the fight against decriminalization of HIV. And I will leave us with the words of Wangari Maathai. Human rights are not things that are put on the table for us to enjoy. These are things we fight for and then we protect. Let's keep fighting. A luta continua.
Okay, thank you, Maureen, and thank you all for joining this session. I do hope that you've been able to learn just be able to learn more around why these laws that criminalize HIV are counterproductive. Yeah, thank you. I hope you've also been able to think about the continued advocacy around these issues. Also, just to share that I've seen most of you have participated in the poll, and most of you actually strongly agree that these laws that criminalize HIV and disclosure, exposure, and transmission are greatly counterproductive. They undermine rather than support efforts to prevent new HIV infections. We've also strongly agreed that instead of criminalization, states should act to create enabling social and legal environments that support safe and voluntary disclosure of HIV, free of stigma and discrimination. So my closing remarks is we need to continue being vigilant. We should not celebrate injustice at any point. We should look out for even other laws that criminalize other vulnerable populations. So for instance, speak against such harsh criminalization laws that, for instance, the Ugandan anti-homosexuality law, because as Alison had rightly put, that it's in the same breath, the same thinking that we find laws put in place to criminalize HIV. So thank you all, and yeah, do have lovely morning, evening, lunch break from wherever you are. Thank you for joining us for the webinar. Okay, bye. Thank you.
Thank you and bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.